In defining civilization, we discovered that early societies developed writing, so they would be able to accumulate ideas and knowledge about traditions they had established. As well, they wanted to record experiences of the past to assist them in continually refining their conceptions, so that they could secure the future of their culture and its people. The perceived wisdom and wealth of the people who occupied the Mediterranean region in ancient times is both captivating and compelling. In almost every field of their endeavour, the Greeks were pioneers. Their considerable achievements in literature, thought, and science are but a part of a wonderful Greek legacy that belongs to the world at large. 776 years before Christ is a date that today symbolically marks a transition from the realm of myth and legends of ancient Greek society to that of its actual history. Not until modern times did startling archaeological discoveries, beginning in the last third of the 19th century and continuing ever since, reveal that great and completely unsuspected civilizations had existed in the Aegean world. In ancient times, the islands of the Aegean Sea played a vital and pivotal role as an intermediary between Egypt, Western Asia, and Europe. Greek men bearing gifts are mentioned in hieroglyphics on southern Egyptian wall paintings from 1500 years before Christ. One of the gifts they brought was a mineral called emery, one of the most durable stones in the world, which was used for polishing hard surfaces, including weaponry. It was mined on the island of Naxos, the largest island in the Cyclades island group and centre of the archaic Cycladic culture, which archaeologists tell us spanned a period 3,000 to 2,000 years before Christ. The islands in the group could only sustain the life of a certain amount of people, and eventually the rapid growth of Greek civilization on nearby larger islands and the mainland meant that people of the islands would migrate and eventually merge with the mainland Greeks and evolve as one. Naxos was not far from the island of Crete, and references made in written inscriptions in Egypt about the people of Crete seem to point to the enormous capabilities of its seafaring peoples. There is a land called Crete in the midst of the wine-dark sea, a fair, rich land surrounded by water, and there are many men in it, past counting, and 90 cities. They have not all the same speech, their tongues are mixed. Among their cities is the great city Knossos, where Minos reigned when 9 years old, he that held converse with the great god Zeus. Crete's economy was founded on agriculture, manufacturing and shipping, with extensive trade routes covering territories as far away as Turkey, Afghanistan, Britain, Scandinavia, the Cyclades, and the rest of the Greek world. The name Minoan, like other stylistic names, was only applied to epochs and eras of our evolution during the 19th century. It was applied to the civilization and culture that grew up on the island of Crete, around 2,600 years to 1,150 years before Christ. Knossos was rediscovered in 1878 by a local merchant, if you can believe his name was Minos, and the British academic Sir Arthur J. Evans was invited by the Greek authorities to excavate the Palace of Knossos starting in 1899. At that time the name Helladic, because the Greeks' name for their land was, and still is, Hellas, was also applied to the ancient remains of the Greek peninsula, and Mycenaean was applied to the peoples of the ancient city of Mycenae, whose greatest period was from around 1400 to 1100 BC, when it was the most important centre, not Athens. Very little was known about Crete and the Minoan peoples before the excavation of its palaces. It was discovered that they were a peace-loving society, which survived without the protection of defensive city walls for over 1,500 years. This was a significant feat, and it reached a high point of its prosperity before being virtually wiped out around 1150, when a great tsunami deluged the island following a massive earthquake nearby. The kings of the Minoan civilization on Crete had ruled a very affluent society, one which exported its excess agricultural surplus and imported exotic luxuries from places like Egypt and Syria. The Minoans also established their great palace complexes on the island of Crete, at Knossos, Phaistos, Malia, and Zakros. The connection between economy and religion is understandable when we realize that the Minoans depended on agriculture for the foundation of their economy, although they traded widely. Religion was very important because the king or priest had to mediate between his people and the gods if they were to have a good harvest and a good life. Evans uniquely turned what had previously been considered mythology into authentic history, strengthening this belief by connecting the scenes in Minoan paintings on the walls of their palaces to scenes from the Greek myths. He informed the world of his discoveries at Knossos through articles written for different journals, as well as the Times newspaper at London, which reported following his death, Sir Arthur John Evans excavated the ruins of the ancient city of Knossos in Crete and uncovered evidence of a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization which he named Minoan. His work was one of archaeology's major achievements, and he greatly advanced the study of European and Eastern Mediterranean prehistory. This type of exposure was a very important aspect of the successful reporting of the site. As Evans and his team progressed, the public enjoyed the mythical and mysterious quality of his reports. Everything around, the dark passages, the lifelike figures surviving from an older world, would conspire to produce a sense of the supernatural. It was haunted ground, and then, as now, phantasms were about. The later stories of the grisly king and his man-eating bull sprang, as it were, from the soil, and the whole site called forth a superstitious awe. On Crete, Evans found evidence of a society ruled by a king through its priests, one in which the imagery and written evidence revealed that the statues of its women were comparable to that of its men. Women, astonishingly it seemed, participated in every aspect of trade and commerce, as well as religion and sport. In 1900, that discovery would have indeed been alarming, in a world where men ruled supreme and women were fighting to have a say, be able to vote and to work. Evans and his team also found 3,000 clay tablets at Knossos, all incised with an ancient script, dating from two different time periods. The first group, written around 1,750 years before Christ, is in a script now known as Linear A. This belonged to the native Minoan culture, and while it shares some symbolism with mainland Greek culture, as yet it has still not been completely deciphered. Other tablets dating from 1400 to 1150 years before Christ were written in a script known as Linear B, which was used by the Mycenaean peoples. This second script was in the style of a known early Greek dialect, and so it was able to be deciphered in 1952. While these tablets provide some written evidence about ancient Aegean civilizations, a great deal of what is speculated about Minoan religion and society is based on the interpretation of the surviving wall paintings and the style of the architecture at Knossos revealed by Evans and his team. The layout of the palace complex comprised of hundreds of rooms, often built 2 or 3 stories high, and also very cleverly adapted to the lie of the land. Post and lintel construction was employed, and amenities included staircases, corridors, porticos, and ramps suitable for vehicles, all arranged around a huge central rectangular court. Surviving frescoes testify to the fact that the Minoans were a civilization parallel to contemporary Egypt and Mesopotamia. They traded with the Egyptians, so the marsh-loving Pyrrhus found itself planted on the island of Crete, while the date palm, although it did not fruit when planted as far north as Attica, would eventually become a symbol of victory. One important fresco restored by Sir Arthur Evans depicts a warrior with stylized representations of lilies, and its format would certainly influence the new designs of the modern world, especially for those designers in search of historical truths. Following the collapse of the Bronze Age in Greece, 12 centuries before the Christ event, there was a period of centuries from which no heritage in stone sculpture survived at all, except for a few works, such as the sculptural relief on the lintel of the Lion Gate at the city of Mycenaean. It still stood to be admired, but was not copied by other generations. Quite unlike the Cretan Minoans, whose society had benefited from trade, the Greek mainland Mycenaean culture, 1600 to 1100 years before Christ, advanced through war and conquest. Its technically more demanding arts seemed to be forgotten, along with the palace patronage, such as that at Knossos, which had encouraged them. Mycenae was a natural rock citadel and capital of the legendary King Agamemnon, and German businessman Heinrich Schliemann, 1822 to 1890, who excavated there, found a well-fortified citadel with strongholds for soldiers, weapons and officials, as well as storerooms for grain in case of siege. He found that the wealth of their community was invested in their king, whose treasures, like the Egyptians, had been placed in his tomb. One of the last ventures overseas of the Mycenaean Greeks was the reputed major expedition against Troy. Legend tells us King Agamemnon besieged the ancient city for 10 years before taking it by deceit. Schliemann funded his own search for the Greek heroes, as recorded by ancient Greek poet Homer in his work The Iliad, to see if they had actually existed. His excavation of the site that was thought to be the Troy of legend found impressive architectural remains of more than 6 cities, all rebuilt on one spot, including a royal treasure of gold. Archaeologists during the 20th century disputed the level he thought was the legendary setting for the battle for Helen, the face that launched 1,000 ships, and the deathly duel between Achilles and Priam's son Hector. At Mycenae, Schliemann did find the ancient city was overcome around 1200 years before Christ in a series of raids by migratory invaders who enslaved the locals, and over time their skilled techniques of writing, craftwork and monumental architecture became all but forgotten, and for a long time Greece and the Greek peoples were historically obscured. Over the centuries, the people reverted to an inward-looking economy based on rural life. Small villages were usually sited near an easily defended high point called a polis, which served as a refuge in case of attack. It also housed the leaders of the community, the priests, and the shrines of its gods. Gradually, as the periods of peace extended, they became larger unified communities, and the term polis was applied to each city-state, and the term acropolis, meaning high town, to the name of the place of refuge around which each town was concentrated and evolved. The society of the Greek city-state was based on the patriarchal family, held together by ties of tribal kinship. As the whole unit grew, it came firmly under paternal authority and protection. The topography of the Greek mainland meant that its mountains isolated a lot of city-states, and each one jealously guarded their own traditions and customs. Eventually, it would be the old problems of defence and security for its citizens that would lead gradually to their leaders having to develop the skills for diplomatic negotiation. This meant that they could settle old scores, old disputes and differences, in the common interest and for the greater good of all. Eight centuries before Christ, towns grew rapidly and began again to look overseas for new resources as well as new land for their citizens in the colonial areas of Italy and Sicily. This expansion through trade and travel would begin reviving skills and techniques of Greek craftsmen as they encountered new cultures and were inspired by them. The classic cypress, Cypressus sempervirens fastigiata, and the more spreading horizontalis, the cypress of literature, is the dense dark column in the landscapes of the Mediterranean. They grow wild among the olive groves in Greece, where they mass into stately ranks. Today they impart the mood of cool elegance and classicism, and are the only variety of cypress known prior to 1600. They have a unique formality which perfectly sets off design in architecture. The land of Attica was unsuited to a simple economy. Nevertheless, it had small pockets of cultivable land. The main activities were forestry, olive growing, or pastoral. Olive trees have a great grace and gravity wherever they are planted, and project an image that, when planted in groves, represents the hopes and aspirations of those who inhabited the classical world. Greek sculpture was the first, the only ancient art to break free from conceptual conventions for representing men and animals, and to explore consciously how art might imitate nature or even improve upon it. There was no conscious striving towards realism until it was understood as a possible and desirable goal, and this began to happen during the 6th century before Christ. The possible connection with Egyptian statuary is immediately apparent when we examine statues designed as grave markers. They are meant to summon up remembrance of the youth and vigour of the deceased, including the traits most admired by their kin and friends, who are often named as donors of the monument. Until 6 centuries before Christ, these statues were rigid in their stance, fists clenched, hanging at their sides, legs stiffly standing together. The Greek genius for learning, adapting and improving means that quite suddenly, visually, there's a complete breakthrough from the conceptual to the observed. Greek craftsmen evolved a new style, one based primarily on the male nude, and it would dominate the visual arts of the Western world for nearly 2.5 millennia. The details of the folds in the garments of marble statues of women are of significance, as were the application of principles of proportion and measurement as they progressed towards a realistic representation of anatomy. However, at this point, there was as yet no national or city standard, each studio or city differing. Inlaid eyes were made of bone, crystal or glass, and the use of colour was more general than casual, with male flesh probably painted red or brown, and female flesh whitened, with eyebrows, eyes, lips, nipples, and pubic hair all highlighted. Relief backgrounds were usually dark blue or red, and the colours were muted by direct sunlight. Fabulous bronzes were cast solid, the originals made of wax with a finished detail that corresponded to the required thickness of the bronze. Then a clay mantle was affixed to the core with rods, melting out the wax as they poured in the bronze. This technique would eventually become known as the lost wax method. By the beginning of the 5th century before Christ, the Greek pantheon of gods were complete, and the great myths about them had acquired a definitive form. Religious life revolved primarily around the cults of the Olympian gods: Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Athena, Aphrodite, Demeter, the twins Artemis and Apollo, Hestia, Hermes, Ares and Hephaestus, and their place of abode was Mount Olympus in northern Greece. The Olympian gods were honoured with offerings of various forms, from animal sacrifice to splendid festivals lasting 2 or 3 days. The god of wine, Dionysus in particular, who may have seemed a shade marginal, was part of a concept or religion, if you like, far more concerned with ritual than dogma. The ancient hymn to Dionysus, attributed to the Greek poet Homer, describes him crossing the sea in a boat by making vine leaves spring from the mast. At his best, Dionysus is enigmatic, the spirit not only of ancient revelry and dramatic poetry, but also of youth and of having a good time. Leisure, and the pursuit of it, is a product of a refined culture. In Athens during the 5th century it became an important activity. At this time the population rose from 30,000 to 40,000 and the Olympic Games were established. The laurel, sacred to Apollo, the sun god, was woven into a wreath to be worn on the hair of winners at games held at Delphi, where the sun god Apollo's sacred sanctuary was sited. The victor was paraded in triumph through the streets, and poems in his praise were sung in public places. Some cities, in their enthusiasm, would also give him front-row seats to public spectacles, making him exempt from taxation and giving him free meals, and in his home city they would erect a statue of him. In the early years of the Olympic Games, its athletes were all citizens, or men of status. A visit to Olympia was an opportunity to enjoy a chronological review of art and architecture, including the Temple of Zeus, built between 470 and 460 BC. In a line on the terrace at the base of the hill of Kronos were sited the state treasuries, where votive offerings to the deity was lasting evidence of their city's gratitude and power. At the heart of the sanctuary was a kind of luxury hostel, the Leonodium, with gardens and fountains, numerous sports structures, including a wrestling school, baths and a gymnasium. A contemporary description of a day at the Games may strike a few chords in our own time. There are enough irksome and trouble things in life. Aren't things just as bad at the Olympic festival? Aren't you scorched there by the fierce heat? Aren't you crushed in the crowd? Isn't it difficult to freshen yourself up? Doesn't the rain soak you to the skin? Aren't you bothered by the noise, the din and other nuisances? It seems to me that you are well able to bear, and indeed gladly endure, all this when you think of the gripping spectacles that you will see. For over 1,000 years, between 776 years before Christ and 395 years after Christ, citizens from all over the classical world flocked every 4 years to Olympia. Spectators came from as far away as Spain and Africa, long distance when you consider that travel in those days was mostly made on foot. There was a public banquet for victors and various private celebrations where the wine flowed and songs, revelry and victory hymns celebrated the occasion. And the whole company raised a great cheer while the lovely light of the fair-faced moon lit up the evening. Ambassadors came from various towns, vying with each other in both dress and paraphernalia. The rich came on horseback and in chariots, the poor on donkeys, in carts and on foot. Food sellers came loaded with supplies, for there was not a town near Olympia. Merchants flocked in with their wares, and artisans came to make figurines for pilgrims to offer to their god. Today all that remains is wind-stirred flowers to evoke the multitudes of people who once came there. The Olympic Games were established to honour Zeus, the most powerful of the Olympian gods. At the heart of the sanctuary was his temple, and inside the cellar, at its heart, was his 13-metre high gold and ivory statue. The Greek writer on mechanics, Philo of Byzantium, enthusiastically declared that it had to be the reason why nature had created elephants. The seated statued image was reflected in a pool of water or oil to prevent the ivory drying out. Zeus sat, sublime, inapproachable, although inclined toward the spectator, and he became the goal of everyone's longing. Not to have seen the Olympian Zeus for any Greek was considered a misfortune. The lifespan of this colossal figure was about 900 years. In the year 40, there was an abortive attempt by the Emperor Caligula to remove it to Rome. However, it was looted and taken to the palace of Chamberlain Lossus in Constantinople, or modern-day Istanbul. There it remained until destroyed by fire in the year 475. However, its general appearance is known from contemporary descriptions on fragments of documents, representations on coins, and small-scale versions which were made by the Romans. The great statue of Olympian Zeus, some scholars believe, lasted just long enough for an artist to be inspired to create the great image of Christ Pantocrator, which appears in many early Byzantine Christian churches. By then, Christianity was the main religion of the Roman Empire, with Constantinople or Istanbul as its capital. So it would appear that the masterful image of the great pagan god Zeus may have lived on in one of the most important symbols of historical Christianity. Today, there is no contemporary comparison to Olympia. You would have to combine a sports complex with a centre for religious devotion, something like putting Wembley Stadium in England together with Westminster Abbey. It is now time to take a break on our journey before we continue on the road to classical Greece.